There.
All right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight in the room, and also to our folks who are participating on Zoom. We appreciate you being here. Come on in. Tonight is a table talk on economics that is co-sponsored by the League of Women Voters of Columbia-Boone County and the Columbia Public Library. And I particularly like the subtitle of this talk, "What the heck is going on with the economy?" So I hope we all get to learn a lot. A big thank you to the League of Women Voters for organizing the program, to our IT staff here, helping us to do the hybrid program. We appreciate that. And thanks for joining us. And I'll turn things over to the League.
Thank you, Lauren. I am just here to help you understand what in the world we are doing. We are trying to think about many ways to communicate information to our community and to our members. One of the things we are considering is podcasts. So we were discussing this at a board meeting, and somebody said, well, we could do that, but you know, a topic that we really ought to be talking about is economics. So we thought, maybe we could just do something about economics and make a podcast out of it. So we are trying to think about this. And furthermore, to our credit, to our wonderful happening, we have a person, Diane Suhler, who's got the expertise to help us understand this. So this is an invitation to you too. If you have interest in podcasts and you want to help work on them, or you've got ideas about podcasts you'd like to hear, tell us, let us know. But tonight, our goal is to summarize the confusing information that we each and everyone hear all the time to try to help us better understand economics. So we're going to ask that you, I'm sure you're going to have questions. You could not have questions. So if you will, we would like to do the presentation, answer your questions at the end. And if you're on Zoom, and I know some of you are, will you please put your questions in the chat? And you can, of course, enter your questions whenever you have them, and we will answer them at the end. The committee members, the people who worked on this presentation, are Elaine Blount, Julie Saperstein, Carol Schreiber, and Diane Suhler. And Carol is going to,
No, it's going to be Diane.
Diane's going to be first. Okay, come on, Diane. Well, I'll trade this with you. Okay.
Well, thank you all for being here. It's good to see you in person, and I can't see you online, but hello to you as well. Sharon did a nice job of introducing this, and this really was just a random talk at one of our board meetings where we were talking about people needing to know about voting and what they have to do, what find their polling place and what they need in order to register and other things. And then we thought, well, sometimes one of the hurdles is really knowing how to vote. And how do you assess an issue and decide this is the candidate that really reflects your views? And so we decided that in a very nonpartisan way, what we would like to do was to maybe clarify some of the economic news that we see every day, so that people can at least, if the economy is a big issue for them when they go out to vote, at least they can go and they can say, well, I can understand what's going on and what this politician or that politician would say. So this is hopefully just a very neutral presentation, a look at where the economy was and where it is today. So can I? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, here it is. Thank you. Sorry. Yes. It's maybe a short presentation. Okay, so just to give you an idea of what we hope to do tonight, we're going to, one of the things I used to always do when I was teaching in the classroom and starting a new topic was to let the students know that it's really hard to jump into a topic without some historical perspective. And so what we want to do is to start to look at the economy, but start before the pandemic. So you have kind of a baseline for where we were 2 years ago, and that will give you a better sense of maybe how the economy is doing today. So we'll do pre-pandemic economy. We'll look at 2020 to 21 to see what happened to the economy during the pandemic, what the policy response was out of Washington, and then kind of from that, try to summarize where we are today. Is the economy doing better, worse, or are we back at the point where we started from in January 2020? And then at the end, we'll give you some resources and maybe get your questions, your comments, and your input as well. Oops. Sorry, just like a dog and pony show.
So we're going to look back before the economy. How is growth in GDP, inflation, monetary policy, and what did the economy look like in January of 2020? And that's where I'm going to start. And to understand it, we're going to use some pictures, so it's a little less. We won't have so many words. And in this one, this graph, if you look at it, it shows the economic growth by months through the years. And if you will look at that second bar, you'll see from the Great Recession to the March of 2020, we had 128 months of continuous growth, which is the first time that's ever happened. On the unemployment picture, it was good news as well as inflation. Unemployment was around 3.5% at that time. It was higher for women and it was higher for women, the unemployment rate, and Blacks and Hispanics. Inflation continued to be low at 1.8%, but if you can see on that chart, about 2015, it was actually at 0%. There was good news and an increasing stock market and a decreasing federal deficit. The stock market hit a high on February 12, 2020 of 29,551 just prior to COVID. And for a little perspective, the stock market closed last Friday, August 5th, at 32,726. So you can see we're better than we were before the pandemic. Other aspects of the economy showed the federal deficit was down, but then in 2020 it skyrocketed. On these graphs, you can see that some of the news wasn't so good back in the end of 2019. Wages were at 2.8, an increase of 2.8%. And if you look at the time of 2009, at the time of the Great Recession, wages had actually been increasing, and then they decreased, and then they slowly increased up through the end of 2019. And the trade deficit had gone down, and the labor participation had gone down to 63%. So the upshot is the economy was doing okay. The stock market was up, decent growth, low inflation, poverty decreasing, stagnant, but we did have stagnant wages and low unemployment. Going into 2020, if you'll remember from the first slide, the first graph, there were 128 months of growth. And at that point in time, at the beginning of the end, well, I think it was at the beginning of 2020, the economists were expecting us to have a recession because we had that long growth. And the Feds were expected to raise the interest rates. Well, then came COVID. And in March 2020, COVID came in with a vengeance, resulting in lockdowns and panic buying. Nationwide shutdowns, working from home, schools closed, empty roads and parking lots. In other words, loss of jobs, loss of income, fear of eviction, and food insecurity. So now Diane is going to take us through this roller coaster post 2020 and then lead us back where we are now.
Okay, very good. Thanks, Carol. And so I think we have a good picture of what it looked like going into the pandemic. The economy was good, it was strong. It was going to run into some bumps though, because as Carol said, we have 128 months of expansion. That's unprecedented. So what goes up must come down. So it was expected that the economy would be going into a recession. But COVID kind of helped nudge it along just a bit. So we want to look at, what did happen when COVID hit. And some of this obviously was the result of lockdowns and some of the working from home. This certainly had implications for the economy. So we look at the major changes there as COVID started to roll through the country. We have 43% of our businesses that temporarily closed. The very first week of the pandemic, when we declared it a pandemic and started some of the lockdowns, 3.3 million Americans filed for unemployment. The next week, we added another 6.1 million people who were filing for claims. GDP, which is our metric for how we determine how big the economy is, gross domestic product, it shrunk by 31%. So, you have a big ball like this and it lost half of it and 1/3 of its air. So significant decrease in economic activities. Bankruptcies went up by 78%. And remember that unemployment rate Carol talked about that was at 3.5%. Now it was at 14.8%. So over an 11% increase in unemployment because of COVID. Okay, and the stock market, as Carol mentioned, right before the pandemic, the Dow Jones, kind of one of our indices that we use to measure the stock market, was at 29,551. 1 month later, it had dropped 20% and was down to 20,188. So significant drop in the stock market. And I'm sure we all looked at our portfolios and, we were a bit shocked to see the change in just a 1 month time period. Okay. The other change were oil prices. And basically the bottom dropped out of the oil market. And that wasn't because of the oil companies, but it was because of you and I. We quit using gas. I don't know about you all, but I can probably count on one hand how many times we filled up our car with gasoline, over the course of the 2 years of the pandemic. So gas usage was down significantly. When demand drops, then you usually see a price drop. So oil prices went from $64 a barrel down to $19 a barrel. So, and with that, so did the price of a gallon of gas. Okay. If you all, I assume that has everyone taken an econ class, whether it was 10 years, 20 years, 50, 100 years ago. Yeah, it's one of those not so good memories for a lot of us. But you may remember John Maynard Keynes was one of the stalwart economists, and his big contribution to economic theory was that sometimes if the economy gets in a hole, then the only way you can dig yourself out is through government action. And that's exactly what happened during the pandemic. It was the federal government that came to the rescue of the economy because we basically had lost 1/3 of our economic activity. So the government stepped in with various rescue plans that we're going to look at, and we're going to try to gauge how successful they actually were. Okay, so the government, their policy tools when it comes to trying to change what's happening in the economy, they have fiscal policy and monetary policy. And some of you may recall from that econ class many days ago, fiscal policy is government spending and taxes. If the government wants the economy to rev up, they spend more money, that puts more money into the economy, and that churns the engine of economic activity. They can also cut taxes, and when they cut taxes, that leaves you more money to spend and put back into the economy. And then if they want to slow it down, they do just the opposite. They raise taxes, they cut government spending. The other tool they have is monetary policy, and monetary policy works through the financial system. And we'll talk a little bit about the tools of monetary policy in a moment. So when we think of the government response and fiscal policy, I think maybe an analogy that we might use, and we have some historians in the room and people who have looked at history before, but I've often remembered an old cliche that they use when they talk about military history, and that's that generals are constantly fighting the last war. And so when you think of, you know, when they're preparing for how they're going to strategically fight a war today, they're using a lot of times the tools and approaches of a previous time period. And in some ways, that was what happened with COVID. The economists at the time were looking back to 2008, 2009, the Great Recession. And with that came that massive decrease in economic activity and just a horrible recession that resulted in. The problem coming out of that was that the government was a little timid in terms of the policies that it adopted to try to dig us out of that recession. And there was concern that we can't borrow too much money, we can't spend too much money. And so it took a long time, about 4, 5, 6 years before the economy came back from the Great Recession. So economists actually were very forward thinking this time, and they said, well, let's not make that mistake this time. And so they decided we're going to make sure that we spend enough so that we come out of this quickly and we don't end up just clawing our way out over many, many years. So kind of the picture kind of describes throwing everything but the kitchen sink at the economy. That was pretty much what fiscal policy did. They created so many new policies that have never been seen before, and may never be seen again. But you know, they basically were very creative in how they decided to approach fixing the economy. So if we look at some of these fiscal policies, you probably all remember the acronym PPP program, the Paycheck Protection programs. You're a small business owner, you keep your employees on the payroll, even though you're not serving customers or actually doing any business. Government would pay you the money so that you could actually pass that money, those incomes on to your workers. Stimulus checks. How many of you got a stimulus check or 2 stimulus checks? Do you need it? No, most of us in this room probably were still collecting our Social Security. Some of us were still working full time. We were just doing it for home. So we got a stimulus check, even though we really didn't need it at all. Did anyone send it back saying, thank you? Well, no, I'm sure some of us thought about it, but not for very long. So stimulus checks, that was another thing. And the stimulus checks really increased people's net worth and their savings account. People came out of the pandemic with lots of money and savings, a lot more than they had going into the pandemic. Unemployment insurance We expanded it to gig workers. The gig workers are the ones who don't have any unemployment benefits if they lose their jobs, if they're the people who just work one job or part-time somewhere. And then they actually increased unemployment benefits by $300 or $600. Number 4 is something that was, again, unprecedented, that the Federal Reserve and the Treasury actually provided loans to small businesses. Again, this is something that didn't normally fall into the purview of those entities at all, but they were actually loaning businesses money to keep them going during the pandemic. And then massive amounts to state and local governments. Anybody remember how much the city of Columbia got in ARPA funds?
Millions, right?
And 25 million? And the county got 35 million? And the state got, I don't know how much, and a lot of this money hasn't even been spent yet. So gives you some sense, this stimulus is going to continue to be around for quite a while. And then some other fiscal measures we probably all heard about, rent and utility assistance. The city of Columbia has given out a lot of rent and utility assistance through some of the not-for-profits. BAC, CMCA have gotten a lot of money for rent assistance and utility assistance. Again, this was to just make sure that people could subsist, those especially who were living on the margins and maybe had lost their jobs. At least they would have money to cover their rental costs and their utilities. So if we add all that up, all those different programs, the fiscal stimulus that came from government spending was over $5 trillion, $5.2 trillion. The total size of the U.S. economy, the GDP, is about 22 trillion. And so you remember the economy shrank by about 31%. And so now we have this fiscal stimulus of about 5.2 trillion, which is about 25%. So basically what we had was the federal government stepping in to provide the spending that was being lost because of COVID. And does that make sense to everyone? Okay, so massive amounts. So I can't even imagine. I was going to divide this up, by 330 million people in the US, but my calculator was a little challenged with those numbers. Okay, so that was fiscal policy. That was only one part of the story. The other part of the story was that we had monetary policy that the government was going to use to help us come out of this pandemic quickly. And monetary policy, this works through the Federal Reserve System, and the Federal Reserve, you can just think of that as our national bank or the central bank. We have, all of our little banks around town, or Bank of America, Boone County Bank, those are private banks, or they're ones that individuals own. But the central bank is the government's bank, and it's the one that is an arm of, in some way, of the federal government. The Federal Reserve has two mandates, or two things they're supposed to do. They're charged with promoting employment, making sure the economy has full employment, and secondly, that prices are stable. So when you think of that, kind of in terms of what they're trying to do, they want to make sure there's jobs and incomes and people are able to work, so we keep our businesses going. And the second thing is they want to deal with inflation. They don't want prices to rise too much, or they don't want them to fall too much either. So they want them to be stable. The monetary policy, how that is used to affect changes is through two particular tools. One are interest rates, and then the second one is the money supply. And in some ways, they're actually very interconnected, but we'll kind of separate them here. Interest rates, if the Federal Reserve wants to use monetary policy to maybe help the economy grow or slow it down, it can change interest rates. If were to want to speed up the economy, it would want to lower interest rates. When interest goes down, you decide, I can buy that new car now, because my borrowing costs are a lot less. And when you borrow that money and spend it on that car, you're adding to the economic activity and stimulating the economy. So they lower interest rates to stimulate the economy. They raise interest rates to slow it down. So it's a very, very simple mechanism that we're trying to use here. The other one is the money supply, and the money supply, it's kind of like all of a sudden there being more money in our pockets. And that's because it's kind of more money flowing through the system. And so a lot more of it ends up in individual hands than that can be used and spent. So the Federal Reserve can also change the money supply. They decrease the money supply, people have less money, they're going to ratchet down their spending. That's going to lead to the economy cooling and contracting a little bit. Everyone good with those tools? Going to turn you all into economists. Okay, so as far as monetary policy, we have the Federal Reserve doing kind of 4 primary things. First of all, they lowered interest rates to 0. If it doesn't cost you any money to borrow money, what are you going to do? Borrow money. Okay, and businesses really took advantage of this. There was a massive amount of new debt that was piled onto the balance sheets of corporations, because it was like, wow, if you're going to give us money, we're going to take it. And a lot of them used it to buy back their stock, which then that's part of the reason the stock market came back so quickly, was because they were getting interest-free loans and they could easily bid up the prices of their stocks. The other thing is the Federal Reserve was also involved in that Paycheck Protection Program and that Main Street lending. So that was part of their purview as well. So they were putting money directly into the hands of businesses. They made sure that credit continued to flow through the economy. That was a real big problem during the Great Recession, because what happened there is banks decided, we're not going to lend any more money. You can come in, you can deposit your money, you can use our banking services, but don't dare ask us for a loan, because we don't know if anybody's ever going to be able to pay this money back, because the economy was in such bad shape. And so banks basically quit lending. And that was, again, one of the reasons why the Great Recession was so bad, is because credit just froze up in all of our financial markets. The Federal Reserve said, we're not going to let that happen again. So they made sure that banks had the incentive to lend money. They guaranteed loans. They did a lot of extra things to make sure that credit would continue to flow in the economy. And then the last thing they did was they decreased the reserve requirement to 0. When you all deposit money into your checking accounts at a bank, you all assume that money is sitting there so that when you go back, it's been sitting in that vault, waiting for you. Okay. How much do you?
Naively, yeah.
Okay. Do you think they keep some of it there for you? Maybe they keep half of it there and they maybe do something else with the other half? Lending. Anyone have a guess of how much they actually do keep against your deposits?
Only about 10 or 12%.
Oh, excellent. That was before the pandemic. It was about 12%. So you put $100 into the bank, they keep $12, in their vault or somewhere. And then they loan out $88 somewhere in the economy. Well, this last change that the Federal Reserve made was they decreased that to 0. So you put money in a bank today and they loan it all out. You put $100 in, they loan it $100 out to somebody else. And so far as I know, but you can check me on this, I don't think they've gone back to their old system yet. So right now, for every dollar that is deposited, banks can loan that full dollar out someplace else. And again, what's that going to do to the economy? Stimulate, yeah, they have a lot more money to loan out. That means there's going to be a lot more money in people's pockets. They're going to spend it. And so that was, again, another one of those policies that really ratcheted up economic activity during the pandemic. Okay. So we can kind of see, we saw how far down we went when the pandemic started. And then we saw, our knight in shining armor came with fiscal and monetary policies. And so we want to see today, 2.5 years into the pandemic, where are we relative to where we started, since we kind of know where we were right before everything started. So we look at unemployment. Where was unemployment before when the pandemic started?
3.5.
3.5. Where's it at today? 3.5. 3.5. So the federal policies worked. They got us back to where we were before. When you look at jobs, that's the job number in thousands of jobs that have been created every month. And I think a headline I saw in the paper yesterday was that every job has now been replaced, or we've gotten every job back that we lost during the pandemic as of yesterday or the day before. Okay, so a lot of those government programs, along with other things, have actually worked. And then wage growth. And this one, if you kind of look, you can see during the pandemic, what was happening to wages. This, if you look at this one, all right. You looked kind of January 22, had wages kind of been trending up. Okay, so that was a real plus from the pandemic and some of what happened. Well, workers got a lot more power and we saw some really significant wage growth, which was very different than pre-COVID. As Carol pointed out, wages have been very stagnant. So a real nice byproduct of the pandemic has been wage growth that we haven't seen for a long time. You can see it's kind of plateaued and started to come down a little bit now. And personal incomes, and I'm sorry, this is kind of a messy graph. I think the main thing to look at is the blue line and the red line, if they're going up or what. And this personal disposable income, that's fancy economic mumbo jumbos. That's just what the money you have left after you pay your taxes, your disposable income. So we can see we actually came out very well from the pandemic in terms of our personal incomes. They've actually increased significantly. And again, a lot of that kudos to the government. It was a lot, their policies that caused incomes to be stabilized and then also to be supported throughout the pandemic, and then also to the labor shortages and the pressure on wages to go up. So we're actually seeing incomes higher today than what we had seen prior to the pandemic itself. Okay. Other parts of economic activity, that first graph, that's the change in GDP. Again, this is our metric for how big our economy is. And we can see, we've had positive growth most of the time. Every quarter, GDP has been increasing, except the last couple of quarters. And I apologize if that's so so tiny, but those last two bars are negative. But every other time during the pandemic, we've actually seen positive economic growth. And real GDP, the light blue line is kind of the trend line where we should be if we had stayed on the path we were on, if we hadn't had a pandemic. The dark blue line shows how we veered from that. But what's happened since then? We've recovered. So the economy has basically recovered very well from the pandemic, both in terms of wages and jobs and employment, and in terms of overall economic activity. Okay. So everyone's good with kind of where we're at. So we want to talk about a couple of the terms we keep hearing in the news all the time. And one of them is recession. Is there everyone? Okay. So we pick up a newspaper, we listen to the news, and there's all this talk that, oh, we're in a recession, or we're going to be in a recession in 6 months, or oh no, we're not going to be in a recession, things are just hunky-dory. So lots and lots of debate about whether we're in a recession, not in a recession, or whether we will be in a recession. So again, we want to figure out, first of all, what is a recession? And a recession basically means that there's some slip in the economic activity. The economy is not working as well as it should. Sometimes if you look at that last note there, some people define it as 2 consecutive quarters of negative economic growth. And if you go back here to this one, you see those 2 little bars that were down below. Okay, that's a lot of the people who are crying recession are looking at those 2 little bars and saying, oh my goodness, the economy shrunk in 2 quarters, so we must be in a recession. But that's only part of the story, because when you look at that middle definition, economists define a recession as a significant, nice, precise term, significant decline in economic activity spread across the economy that lasts more than a few months and is usually visible in production, employment, personal income, other indicators. And so that's what really muddies the water about whether or not we're in a recession. If you use that last one, that 2 consecutive quarters of shrinking GDP, yeah, we would be in a recession, but that's too narrow. If we look at production, if we look at employment, if we look at personal income, do those point to a recession? Yeah, we just saw personal incomes are up, employment is up, production is still very strong. Some months it's way up, some months it's just very stable. Okay, so we try to answer this question, are we in a recession? And I think, we have some things pointing to yes, some things pointing to no. We have had the 2 quarters of negative economic growth. Personal consumption has slowed. We're still consuming a lot, but maybe at a little slower pace than we did before. Disposable income is strong, except when we adjust it for our purchasing power or inflation, we actually do have less money than we used to have. So that's a negative factor. And industrial production, what manufacturing is producing has been kind of very flat or trending downward a little bit. So those are the signs pointing that maybe we are in a recession and moving towards a recession. But if you look at the blue side, we have never had a recession when we have employment increasing. So always to have a recession, you have to have people getting laid off or fired or losing their jobs. And we don't have any of that right now. In fact, jobs are being added in the hundreds of thousands. If you look at that last one, we added 528,000 jobs this last month. So that's certainly not a recession. And to give you a little metric for understanding that, the old rule of thumb in economics used to be that when you have new workers coming into the economy who are graduating from school and trying to find jobs versus those who are leaving the workforce, retiring, dying, whatever the case may be, that in order to keep our unemployment rate stable, we had to create 150,000 jobs every month so that those coming in and those going out would be even and our unemployment rate wouldn't start to rise at all. So we can often use 150,000 jobs as that benchmark. So if we're creating 528,000 jobs this last month, does that seem like a recession?
But I think a recession is almost inevitable because the Federal Reserve is committed to get their overwhelming priority looking forward. It's to get inflation down. Inflation's been running at about 9% a year. And the Federal Reserve is simply going to have to push up interest rates so high as to slow down spending. Housing is going to really take a big hit. Mortgage rates are going to go way up. And I think the Fed is committed overwhelmingly. We've got to get inflation down. I'm sorry if it causes a recession, but I think a side effect of this will be we almost inevitably are going to go into a recession later by the beginning of next year. That's just my opinion.
No, that's a great point.
In order to contain inflation, we can't be living with 9% a year inflation. Because once it gets built into people's expectations, then you get this wage price spiral like we had in the 1970s, in which Paul Volcker, when he said the Fed had to put interest rates at 22% to cause a huge recession to knock out the inflation. If you throw enough people out of work, wages won't rise, firms won't be able to raise their prices because they can't sell their products. And we don't want to get into a situation where the Fed has to put interest rates at 20% and cause a huge loss of jobs. So I think you're going to see the Fed raising interest rates sharply the rest of this year and early next year. And in my opinion, 90% probability we will get a recession. Not now, but by the beginning of next year.
And that's certainly the case, because remember, that's the whole point of raising interest rates. And you raise interest rates to slow things down. It's the rain that pulls in the economy. So, and that should happen if we're growing too fast and we're running on too high of a rate.
I've always been curious where consumer debt plays into all of these economic factors, because we are now on a trajectory of, I think, almost unprecedented consumer debt, because we just continue to spend and spend and spend, even though all of our stimulus money is gone. We're running up our credit cards. We're jumping into overpriced housing. I mean, where has that ever played out in economics? And aren't we using old measures for new unprecedented economic phenomenons that, I mean, how do you measure global supply chain interruptions, and how do you measure wars and cutting off gas and natural gas supplies in what's going on? To how does that explain in old economic measures what we're dealing with right now? I guess I'm more curious than anything, because what I hear is that how we measure inflation right now is the way we've always measured it, but we have something that's really new, that the supply chain interruptions, the interruption in our oil and gas production, where you have oil and gas producers who won't get back in the market because they're afraid of regulations against fossil fuel. And I mean, it's just so different now than 20 or 30 years ago.
Yeah, and it does seem different. And if you can hold that thought for just a minute.
You'd ask us to hold our questions till you're done with the presentation.
Right,
So,
we're almost there.
Okay,
Sorry, okay, and then, but that's fine, because those are really good questions and comments. And they certainly play into the discussion we were hoping to have this prompt among us. Okay, so I guess the kind of the point of this was there are a few things that point to a recession, but overwhelmingly, this doesn't look like an economy that's in recession now. That's not saying it won't go into a recession, but right now we are not, certainly not in a recession. But a recession can become a self-fulfilling prophecy. And one of my favorite economists, Robert Shiller, who won the Nobel Prize, he's a behavioral economist, which means he marries psychology with his economic theories. He was saying that, there's a good chance we'll go into a recession because consumers and companies are preparing for the worst, just like you outlined. Interest rates are going up. That means that it's going to ratchet down the economy, and we better batten the hatches and prepare for it. And that fear can actually lead to that becoming a reality. So it's kind of the danger of our news media, that bangs this drum over and over and over. We're in a recession. We're going to be in a recession. A recession is coming, because it does put that idea in people's mind, and then it starts to change their behavior, certainly. Not that it can't happen, but it's just, it amplifies it more than it maybe should be. Okay. And inflation, that certainly is the other side of this. And we can see certainly inflation is higher. But one thing I think to look at, if you look at the Great Recession of 2008 and 9, and actually coming out of that until almost 2021, the Fed always wants some inflation, 2.5%. Okay, because that's just a sign of a healthy economy, that prices are rising, people are demanding goods. That's, it's a healthy sign for an economy. There has been a lot more danger from 2009 until about 2017, 18, that inflation was too low. And there was concern even at some points that it would be deflationary, that prices would start to decline. And that's actually worse, because that sets up a mentality that, oh, I won't buy something today because it'll be cheaper tomorrow because prices are going down. So if you look, it really wasn't until just right prior to 2020 that we did start to see prices of that inflationary level getting back to what would be considered normal. But certainly now it's very abnormal because it is increasing, and that is much higher than it should be. I'm not sure why it's quite that high, but it's running at about 9% now. Is that correct?
Tomorrow they'll release new figures.
What's that?
Tomorrow we'll release new figures.
Okay, good. Okay, so inflation certainly is an issue, and we can kind of see on the top, you see all the bars of what inflation has been on a monthly basis. And then on the bottom, we kind of look at sectors and the difference in inflation by sector. And we can see a lot of the inflation has been in food and gas and cars and things that, we all feel because we have to fill up our pumps with fuel and we are buying food. So we've all certainly been affected very much by inflation. But some areas of the economy haven't been as impacted. So when you look at shelter, and this is, these are kind of pre-2022 or early 22. So some areas haven't been seeing as much inflation as others. So I think the upshot here is that we see some segments of the economy where we've had a lot of inflation, especially in energy and food and grains and commodities. But those then bleed and affect a lot of other sectors. And so just as we've seen inflation rise as those price increases trickle through those different sectors of the economy, we'll see it on the downside too. We're seeing gas prices decline now. That should start to show up in lower prices in other segments as well. So I think it's kind of inflation certainly has been a problem, continues to be a problem. Whether or not it will be as bad of a problem going forward or not is a little hard to say, but certainly the Fed is trying to raise interest rates to get inflation more under control. And kind of with that, we're not alone. Okay. A lot of times we look at the US and we think, oh, we're the only one who's being affected by it. But you look, the tan areas, the dark areas, those were all parts of the world that are being impacted by inflation. And so, the Soviet Union is right there with us. And Latin America is even worse, having worse problems than we are. When you look at that, Africa and the Middle East are the only parts of the world that seem to have not been impacted by inflation as much yet. Okay. And we think of, why are we seeing this inflation? And this goes to Linda's point, part of it are these supply chains. And again, we can blame, new technology that we've been using, the JIT, just-in-time inventory systems. Companies get the inventory in the back door and they want to sell it out the front door immediately. Nobody wants to hold that inventory any longer. And that's been part of the problem with the pandemic. It broke those supply chains. So there was nothing coming in the back door, so nothing could go out the front door either. And so what was sitting in stock, the price was going to be bid up on that. And then China, their lockdowns have certainly played an impact, especially on car prices, on other sorts of prices, worker shortages. As Linda mentioned too, the Ukraine situation is certainly an anomaly. We don't often have a war that impacts oil markets the way that did, or grain markets. But then we did have the oil embargo back in the 1970s, which really precipitated inflation there that you talked about in the 1980s. So part of that was, again, geopolitical. It wasn't all just kind of non-political factors. And then, we have supply issues, we have demand issues, and there's been a lot of criticism of the federal government that, the policies they put in place trumped up demand so much that gave people so much money, and that's been an issue with causing inflation. And that certainly was the case. We should have sent those stimulus checks back. We shouldn't have kept them and spent them. We've had CARES Act, we've had stimulus payments, we've had all this money, and that certainly has led to some inflation as well. And then the Fed's monetary policy, they thrown a lot of money out into the economy as well. So lots of different factors, but again, it's hard to pinpoint exactly what's the major factor. But I think, we can see it's a very complicated situation as far as what created inflation. And I guess this is something that we often don't hear about. We got some really, really powerful corporations in our country. Monopolies, one seller in a market, oligopolies, 2 or 3 sellers in a market. And guess what happens when they decide to raise prices? Do they have competitors who are paying them? No. So when you look at oil prices, you look at drug prices, you look at soda prices, you look at automobiles, those were all very small markets or big markets where 2 firms control the prices. Greed we're gonna look at some profit figures here in a minute. So a lot of profits have been made during the pandemic because of these rising prices. And then herd mentality. One company raises their price, another firm says, oh, they raised their price, I can do it too. And so everybody jumps on the bandwagon. And so we see prices going up because of everyone imitating or following the leader. And this print is probably too small to read, but you know, Chevron, their profit went up 240%, Steel Dynamics 809%, fertilizer giant, their profits shot up 1.2 billion. Nike, you know, why do shoes have to go up? Shoe prices 53% increase in profit. Dr. Pepper and Keurig, are we all drinking more coffee? I don't know, but anyway, you know, all these companies have made gigantic profits as a result of this inflation because they have been able to increase their prices. Okay, so I guess kind of that kind of brings us to kind of the end of kind of looking at where we were. We started the pandemic with a fairly strong economy. We lost a lot of our strength, but it quickly came back a lot because of government intervention. And now I would say we're probably close to where we were, if not better than where we were at the beginning of the pandemic, but we do have problems with that inflation. The debt actually got really low during the pandemic because people were getting stimulus checks. They were not spending money, so they paid off their debt. But guess what? Everybody's out borrowing again now. And so it's not going to last for very long. So, and then we have the threat of a recession possibly if the Fed does indeed maybe tighten interest rates too much, and that ratchets down economic activity. So that's kind of, I hope, gives you an idea of where we've been, where we are, maybe where we're going. And we're going to talk, Sharon has some resources she's going to tell us about. And then we were just going to talk about some, you know, just your thoughts and see if we can take some questions. And maybe you all have some answers to some of the questions.
The resources are on the table. The resources are on the back table. We put together a list of possible resources that you might read and on your own. We also have the library's newsletter that gives you some information along this line. So you're welcome to take both of those. Questions. We have a question from our Zoom audience. So shall we start with it?
Sure.
So the question is, has the positive wage growth been offset negatively by inflation?
Anybody want to answer that? I think inflation is what, about 9%, wage growth was about 5%. So if you just look at it, you know, those comparisons, we would say yes. But a lot depends on what people are spending their money on, like education. Larry?
Well, it's kind of right toward my question is, what sector of people are we talking about? We looked at sectors of the economy, but what socioeconomic, ethnic, regional variations may change that complexion. So, you know, I, as a white male, Midwestern middle-class person, am not experiencing the drama, but I got a neighbor who is, and so on. So what does that mean to specific groups?
Okay, I'm going to repeat it for the Zoom audience.
Please.
It's not the whole thing, but the question was, is this pain, economic pain, different for different sectors of the population, right?
And that's a great question, because we could probably go around this room and see how many of you feel like you're really being impacted by inflation. Very many of us.
I was just thinking, coming over, when I first started to drive a car, an hour's wage bought me about 4 gallons of gas. So minimum wage now, $15, $16, buys you about 4 gallons of gas. That didn't change, but we were in a period when gas was so cheap
Yeah.
relative to the rest of the world, particularly. So, but those things vary again about what you can afford and have to make decisions about. When one goes, when things, some things you buy goes up, things you go down. But I heard just the other day, yeah, employment is great. Now we're back to having 2 jobs again to make a living. So that variation is so crucial.
Well, and your question about where do you feel it, I think we all would have to say that our food costs have changed.
And for most of us, we substitute other things, the beef gets expensive, you go to chicken, or you go to lentils, or you buy something else.
I've been curious about how much wages contribute to GDP versus something like profits contributing to GDP.
Hmm.
And how that has varied over the last 50 years, or maybe even longer since I've been alive.
I think the share of the economy going into profits has been trending upward. And the share going into wages has been trending downward for at least the last 20 years, which maybe suggests that there's increasing market power on the part of corporations compared to what they used to have.
Sure.
The government used to really enforce antitrust laws and prevent a lot of mergers to try to keep a lot of competition. And the government's kind of backed off, it seems to me, on enforcing antitrust.
Was that what we called greed?
Well.
Abuse, for sure.
I don't know if that's greed or not.
That's the last statistics I saw. It used to be that corporate profits were about 9% of what they call national income, the total income that goes to people in the economy. But the last I saw, it was now 14% of the income. And that obviously has come from wages.
And again, what people profit from larger corporation profits.
Oh,
And
exactly.
so
Yeah.
not all of us are invested in those successful corporations.
That's very true. So that we've seen that 1%, their incomes have gone up as that share of profit has gone up as well. And they've taken it from those people at the bottom who have lost, whose incomes haven't gone up or wages have stayed very low. So, yeah, it's been very inequitable as far as how it's affected different segments.
I have a question about workers who are available. And because of family connections, I've experienced a lot of this over the last few years, not enough workers. And then someone reminds me, oh yeah, a lot of us baby boomers got out. And not as many folks are coming in. And when you shut down a certain amount of immigrant labor, then we wind up with not enough workers. So could you speak to the issue of other indicators say economy is growing, but we don't have enough workers. What's that about?
Okay, good question. And that's another thing when we look at that low unemployment rate, partly it's low because we have fewer people participating in the economy. But that's actually been a trend that's been happening for about the last 10 or 15 years. We've had people who have just kind of dropped out of the labor market. And ironic, well, probably isn't ironic. It tends to be males between, say, 25 and about 55. And part of it has been due to opioid addictions and other things. Part of it, I think, there's just a myriad of factors that for some reason, men have been dropping out of the labor force at greater rates than, say, females, and more females are coming into the labor market. But there's a lot of work. Ellen Kruger was an economist who really tried to look at that and figure out why the disparities and why there was that decrease in participation by young men. And I'm not sure he's ever really nailed it down exactly, but so it's a huge concern. It's the young men or middle-aged men who have really dropped out of the workforce, and that's where a lot of these shortages come from. Part of it, I think, too, is our, just our drug testing. If, you smoke a joint over the weekend and then you have to go in and take an employment test and you can't get the job because you have, vestiges of that in your urine sample, that knocks a lot of people out of the labor market. And, it's the choice of giving up your recreation or giving up your job. I probably would offer my job too, but that was a joke. So I think, changes in drug laws could certainly make a difference or companies not having drug policies that are quite as stringent could make a difference. I'm not sure, but that is a real issue. It's that age group that has really dropped out of the labor market that baffles everybody.
I don't know that I'm still clear on what GDP is measuring, but I have heard over the last couple of years, coming out of some scholarly publications, and elsewise. Is it such a bad thing that we don't have positive GDP growth? Why do we have to have 22% or 3% or 4%? And what does that really mean for us? And so I guess my question would be, are we back to an old measure, and does it make sense when it's kind of like measuring year after year sales increases, and to maintain that 2% growth, that's a whole lot more sales than from 0 to 1 when you're just starting out. And so what are we truly trying to say when we say it's only 2% growth or 3% growth, and I'm so disappointed it's not 5? Where's that growth going to come from when there's a huge global effect of COVID going on? And so I guess, I question how
And we also have, we're not continuing to increase in our population growth at the same level we did before.
I think there's kind of a trade-off. If you have a white-hot economy that's really booming, people at the bottom of the scale really benefit. People that are on the borders of being able to get a job or not. And so if you're worried about inequality, which I am, the people at the bottom of the scale really benefit, when the nation is really rising rapidly. Jobs are opening up. They can get a job or a better job. So that's one thing to consider. But on the other hand, when the economy is white hot, you're more likely to have inflation, which causes problems. So there's these trade-offs. But the last people to get hired,
right.
Right. Ones with lesser skill
Right.
and low income.
And I understand that, but when you have 4% or 3.5% and everybody's starved for labor, then is it such a bad thing that we don't have growth? And isn't it explained by the fact that you're already at near full employment? And so is it such a bad thing? I mean, is it indicative of something that's tragic? And because everybody's fully gainfully employed, they might have 2 jobs, but they're gainfully employed. And so I guess that I'm curious about that focus or that overexcitement of this lack of material growth as measured the way that we normally, if we had 9% or 10% unemployment, that would be one thing, but when it's so low, anyway.
Would that be reflected in the map of the globe you had up earlier, in the countries that weren't suffering inflation, or countries that are not so invested in lots of consumer?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
It's a question.
I have a couple of Zoom things.
Can I just?
Go ahead.
I think you're raising a wonderful question, Linda, because we value growth, or that we just put that as the one metric that we can see, you know, if we grow 5% or 10%. But the only thing that economics ever says is you want your growth to keep up with your population growth. So if your population's growing by 2%, then your economy should probably grow by 2% to maintain the same standard of living. But there's no reason why we need to grow by 5% when we have zero population growth, except that it looks good.
Mhm.
You know, you can point to it and say, wow, look at how well we're doing. But it just, there's no other justification. But it's an easy metric.
So somebody helped you out.
Oh.
I did the math on the 5.2 trillion divided by 330 million people. It comes out to $15,757 per person.
Wow.
I didn't get my share.
And there's also a question that person helped you. Is there any prediction as to how the housing market will affect the economy in the future? Or we could look at it, you know, vice versa too. How is the current market influencing the housing market? Prices have surged so much, and I don't think the prices can just keep going up and up. Is there a bubble? Will it burst?
That's a great question. That was the one thing about the 2008, 2009 recession. It did break that myth that housing prices could only go up. And we saw, you know, very quickly that housing prices can come down. So I think that's a good point. Housing prices could come down, and we're starting to see that demand is starting to fall. And you know, I don't have a blackboard, but you know, your supply and demand curve. If demand starts to decline, you know, prices will start to fall as well. And that's when you would have that bubble starting to
House
go.
prices fell 33% nationwide in the crash that started in 2008. And in some cities, the worst was Phoenix, where house prices fell 60%. So a $500,000 house at one point dropped to $200,000. That was a humongous bubble. House prices were rising 30–40% every couple of years in some of the big cities. I don't think we have that kind of a bubble now, although house prices, I think, have been up about 20% in the last year in the US. I think I saw a figure like that.
Yeah.
But that doesn't compare to what was happening, you know, in the first 10 years of this century, or 2000 to 2010. Huge bubble in house prices.
Are there significant regional differences in that too? I mean, California, of course.
Right, yeah, Phoenix, yeah, Los Angeles, San Francisco, those cities, much more than, you know, cities that aren't, cities where there's plenty of land nearby, house prices didn't go up near as much.
And 2008 was such a different phenomenon that caused that housing burst as what we're dealing with now. You have so many hedge funds and things that are buying up properties, and never before have we had that kind of pressure on the housing market. And then with COVID and people being able to relocate and work from home, I mean, that's caused a lot of shifts. And so the reasons for those were different, and hopefully we'll never have a 2008 again if we keep our regulations in place. But this one is, as a realtor friend of mine said, this is a long time in coming as well, because we just haven't kept up with our building. But then builders would say, well, we were so unsure about those millennials because they were putting off getting married and having families and needing bigger homes. I mean, it's kind of one of those perfect storms that we had this time, whereas last time there was just so much credit unworthiness and easy credit, and that everybody who was renting an apartment could qualify for a house and was running to buy a house. hopefully we'll never have that again. All the derivative markets and secondary markets and things that were crazy.
We have what they call ninja loans, no income, no job, no assets.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, we give you this $200,000 mortgage, and the reason was they were gonna sell that mortgage off within 2 weeks to be put into a mortgage-backed bond. So the lender had no incentive to be strict and about the person's qualification. Anybody that walked in the door, yeah, here's the $200,000 mortgage. I know you don't have a job. There was some guy in California who income was 14,000 a year, was able to get a $700,000 mortgage.
But didn't we put some regulations on?
That's really changing now. They're really tightening down the mortgage. That's not gonna happen again.
Right,
We
but
learned
we
from
don't
that.
want what has happened this time to happen again either. We don't want COVID again.
And going back to the housing market, actually, if prices are high, that actually might be good for the housing market, because as you said, the supply has not kept up with demand. And that's, part of the housing affordability problem. We're not producing enough houses to increase that supply that would bring the prices down. So maybe the silver lining of all of this is this will bring more companies into the market to build houses because they are very profitable, and that'll help to decrease prices overall and make more.
Of course, the price of materials, connected to supply
Yeah.
chain has been a part of that in the last 2 years.
That's true. But assuming that kind of gets sorted out and building materials start to go back to their normal prices or semi-normal, then you might see actually some real positives in the housing market.
And the building was, it occurs to me, it's sort of like the just in time. They did not want to have very many houses on the market that weren't already sold. So it was
They
that.
got their wish.
Yeah, that's true, yeah.
I was remembering teaching when just in time was just being introduced, oh, wonderful this was. No inventory has to be. Now we get to the place and, geez, I wish I had inventory. So,
Well, and I think we found out too, how much we have been willing to outsource overseas and let go of when COVID first started, I remember coming home and telling him, you better refill as many prescriptions as you can because your generic medication that you need is made in China. And if they lock down and they're not producing it, and so we started going, oh my God, and Taiwan produces 90% of our semiconductors. And so I think it's caused us to go, yeah, just in time was great, except our supply chains are so thin and we're so dependent on other countries that as soon as there's a hiccup. The other thing is, that some of the stories that I've been listening to about inflation have caused people to, if you hear them being interviewed, they'll say, well, I was going to go out and buy a new car, but I think I'll just hold off and drive my car another year. Or we were looking at buying a new house, but I think I'll stay in my house another year. Or I was going to buy, we were going to go out and spend $100 for dinner at a restaurant, but I think we'll do this instead. And I think it wakes us up to how consumer-driven, consumption-driven that we are. And sometimes those don't have a lot of rational decision-making behind it.
Consumption rational?
Yeah. And we fall into this mode, and then all of a sudden we go, oh, the government gave us all this money and we've gone out and spent it, whether I needed to or not, whether I needed that new washing machine, sometimes it's a wake-up call. As hard as it is on low and lesser income people, my heart bleeds for them. The rest of us who just continue to spend because we can, are we contributing to this over demand and lesser supply problem?
That's a good point, and I'm sharing something I heard on the radio that kind of harkens back to that is some young person who they were complaining about Starbucks raising the price of their lattes or something to $6 or something for a latte. And this young woman was saying, that's awful, you know, it really makes it very expensive. And then she finally sat down and did the math that she was buying a latte a day every month. So $180 for, you know, a cup of coffee. And it was their wake up call. She said, wow, I can buy a coffee maker and, you know, 20 pounds of coffee for a lot less than that. So and maybe that's what we need to do, is all sit back and say, you know, what are necessities? What are these luxuries that we really don't need or can't afford to let go of? And, yeah.
I think you're gonna see the Fed keep raising interest rates until they kill off this inflation. The Fed meets 8 times a year, about every 6 weeks. And, you know, the forecast is they're gonna raise it 3/4 of 1 percentage point, the rate that they set, which in turn sets rates for all kinds of borrowers. What's called the prime loan rate is kind of a benchmark rate that is set 3 percentage points above the rate that the Federal Reserve sets. So if the Fed sets their short-term rate at 2%, the prime loan rate is 5%. And people that borrow from banks, depending on their, you know, their credit standing, might pay 6%, 7%, 8%, et cetera. So you're going to see the Fed keep raising interest rates until they simply choke out this inflation. There's no doubt in my mind that they're going to do that, and that's the correct priority. We cannot be having 9% inflation a year, and the Fed can control that by putting interest rates high enough to slow down spending, so firms simply can't raise their prices 9% a year. And so you're going to see a series of big increases in interest rates by the Federal Reserve, and that's going to knock inflation back down.
Is there anything else that can control inflation? Is there any other policy or pattern of living that we can talk about as inflation lowering beside what the Fed does?
Demand.
Supply can really make a difference.
Competition.
You know, try to get a competitive economy, break up the big monopolies, try to promote competition.
Yeah. I'm thinking a few years ago, I was working the farm crisis well in the 1980s, but we watched again in agricultural commodities. You know, 1 of 3 companies control most of the food production in the world now. And you think, well, that could be broken up, that would shift the whole thing. So that sounds good to me, competition.
Right, and we're very fortunate Biden has put in some really progressive people who are really fighting the corporations. Lena Khan, she's the economist. She wrote a really scathing article of Amazon being such a monopoly, but she is now the head of the FTC. And, you know, so he's gotten some really good people who are ready to fight for competition in a lot of these markets and start to break up some of those monopolies and oligopolies. So that's when the supply is a big thing, you know, because if you can just bring more supply onto the market, and sometimes that's by adding additional competitors to your market. If you have more firms supplying the good, you get, you know, the prices automatically have to come down. Larry mentioned, you know, the immigration. We get more workers coming in, that's going to bring down labor costs. Not that we necessarily want to see that, because, you know, I think workers are finally getting maybe some raises that are really justified. But so you can work on the supply side as well, which is housing. You increase the supply of housing, then you're going to bring down housing prices. So besides interest rates, supply and demand can also have impacts as well. And people just will respond. It may take some time to some of these other factors, but it can have a definite effect.
A cultural change where new was not so valuable would have a tremendous impact on comfort of living standards.
You know, it's an interesting thing. My daughter is in her 20s and all of a sudden it's like she likes to go to used clothing stores. She doesn't want to get a new iPhone, you know, so there is a lot of
There's a
things
new trend.
from younger people, I think.
That's true, yeah, so if we can just instill kind of a new behavior model in people, that would make a difference.
I keep thinking, why isn't there a repair economy coming back? Things can be repaired. That would be a job and would require material, it have to be. You know?
That's very true, you know. Maybe going back to the point about interest rates too, you know, we lowered interest rates in 2008, 9, and we have never got them back to the level that they were at prior to the Great Recession. So we're all living in this false world where we think interest rates should be low, but prior to that, you know, interest rates were, you know, 3-4%, the Fed rate. So we've just gotten used to what we think are low interest rates, and now everybody's crying, you know, oh, the Fed's raising interest rates, and really they're just bringing them back to normal where they should have been. And then they may raise them beyond that, but they aren't even back to normal levels yet.
Same with inflation. I mean, we're all old enough to remember double-digit inflation, and it wasn't all that long. I mean, the first house I bought was 18%, but I also got a 20% merit increase that year. So, I mean, those days are gone, but I have to smile when I see young news anchors talking about this well, it's not unprecedented, but you're just not old enough to remember what we had to do when it was 18%. So we didn't get to buy a house unless we absolutely had to have one.
Right. So the solution is to get old people on.
Yeah.
this news. Have some institutional
I mean,
knowledge.
they don't want to hear our old story.
Well, there's kind of two things. One is, yes, traditional wisdom, but also what you were saying, Linda, too, about this is different set of complexity.
Yeah.
Too. And so they're kind of both the old and a new
Yeah.
dimension with this. Yeah.
That's true, very true.
One of the things I think has gone up over a period of years is the assumption that profits should be higher than they used to have to be.
Mhm. Yeah, very true. There's a Thomas Piketty, who's a French economist. You may have heard of him. He has, I'm sure, on the library shelves about a 600-page book called Capital. And he has a wonderful, well, I have a T-shirt I had made because I love the way he frames that whole issue. And it's a very simple. It's just the letter R, and then the greater than G. And that sums up the entire whole issue of income inequality. R is the return to capital, you know, the profit that's being made, the return on investment on shares. G is the growth in the economy, which is synonymous with growth in wages and kind of people's incomes. And so income inequality can be summed up in that little teeny equation. You know, we get greater income inequality because the return to the people who own capital has been so much greater than the return that's been going to the workers. And I think if we could flip that, you know, we would see a very different reality as far as the economy and incomes and our standard of living.
And he has a plan to flip that.
He does. Yes, he
Well,
does.
was anybody surprised after the 2017 tax reform that corporations didn't plow their newfound profits back into their employees and capital? They just bought back stock and drove their prices up. And I mean, I benefited because I have a portfolio, but
Yeah.
that's not how it was supposed to be.
Very true. That's a great point.
We are approaching the bewitching hour. And as we promised, we were exploring a very complex topic that influences people all the time. And I hope that you will continue to find new information and put it together with what you already know to answer some of these questions. I think as a society, as a group, as a community, we need to make our wishes known about how our world operates. And we in the league would very much appreciate if you have other ideas about things you would be interested in doing. And if anybody is interested in working on our podcast, please let me know.
Thank you all. Good night.
Thank you, Diane.
Thank you all for coming.
Diane, those are stuff.